Good evening and welcome to tonight's special meeting of the Board of Education. This meeting is called to order at 4:59 p.m. Roll call, please.
Ms. Armstrong,
Present.
Dr. Alhesson,
Present.
Mrs. Garza,
Present.
Ms. Stewart,
Present.
Mr. Critchfield.
Present. Tonight we do not have requests addressing agenda items. Ms. Acevedo, do we have any corrections to this evening's agenda?
We do have a correction this evening. We have an amendment to the title of item 6.1. The title should read Resolution to Order Biennial Governing Board Election. Hold on just 1 minute. We have an echo.
Sounds handsome.
Okay, that's okay. Replacement pages have been provided for this item. They're also on the back table.
Thank you for that. Tonight, Deputy Superintendent Dr. Ryan Smith will be leading us in the flag salute.
Thank you, President Critchfield. Everyone, please rise. Put your hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. All right, moving on to our first discussion item. We have a discussion item on a contract for Premier Speakers Bureau. Ms. Acevedo, do we have any information on this?
Yes, so good evening. This evening, we have a new contract coming to the board for approval. As requested previously, any contract to be established outside the approved contract template will need to be brought to the board for approval. The contract for Premier Speakers Bureau falls outside of our approved template. And because of that, our general attorney will provide you some background to this contract.
Thank you, Madam Interim Superintendent. So this item was brought before you because it does deviate from the template contract that the board had approved last year. And there are certain provisions within this contract that were troublesome to me. But the reality is that these are general boilerplate contracts. The agency that gathers these speakers, they have a set term that they provide, and they don't deviate from that term. So even if we wanted them to go with our contract, they would just say no and basically move on. So that I wanted to bring this up as a test case because there are certain contracts within the district that we will not be able to get the vendors to conform to the template that we provide, mainly because the bargaining power is in their hands. We want the service, they provide the service, therefore they have the leverage when it comes to the terms that they offer for that service. Other contracts differ greatly from this one, but I did want to bring it to your attention because there are certain provisions in there that would basically open up the school district to liability should something occur. However, pretty much every engagement that this certain agency does and agencies like them, these contracts are very similar. And I just wanted to notify the board that, there are some things in this contract that are concerning, but because of the situation and the way that the relationships work, it's basically one of those where we don't have much leverage to force them to change any of the terms.
Thank you, Mr. Strega. Discussion from the board or questions? Ms. Stewart.
Can you tell me some of the concerns, please?
Yes. So basically in the cancellation, for example, if within 60 days of the event day there's a cancellation, we would have to surrender the entire amount of the engagement, which is $18,000. Generally, you look for a little bit more favorable cancellation policies. In this one, even if the speaker's unavailable, they'll try to find a replacement. And at that point, we have no say in who that replacement is. There's, different general liability stuff like indemnification. We're required to indemnify the agency should something come up, a lawsuit, a trip and fall, things of that nature. There's also a force majeure, which basically, if an act of God happens, they're basically not liable for producing the service that was paid for. And then even some of the marketing and social media stuff, we have to go to them to get the approval first. So it's just things of that nature that are very skewed in favor of the agency providing the speaker, but that's generally how these contracts run anyway, and it's very hard to get them to deviate.
So although there's some concerning things, this is pretty normal.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart. Board Member Armstrong.
Okay, with what we are wanting is that the content that they are going to present, are there any other companies that present that same type of content?
So I can't speak to what the district wants in terms of content. I know that it was made clear to me that the speaker was someone that was wanted to bring in because of some of his background and kind of history and things that he can put forth to members of the district. And you can go to other agencies, but every agency you go to pretty much has the same standard contract that they're going to put out.
So as far as the work ethic from this company, do they have a reputation of honoring their contract, or do they have a reputation of,
So I did do some research on the company. They don't have any real history of lawsuits with their clients or anything like that. It's just more of a heads up to the board, because at the end of the day, this does deviate from what the board had basically prescribed previously through the template contract, and I felt it was in the best interest to allow the board to be aware of it in case something does happen later on. This was discussed, but the reality is very high probability that nothing will happen, everything will go smoothly.
Okay, because I was reading this, so like the expenses that they will incur, will we, as a district, since we're paying, will we make sure that the cost will be reasonable? Like some of the other expenses that come with it.
So those expenses are built into the contract, and the
Okay.
agency is required to pay the speaker for those incidentals.
Okay. And I think that was my last question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Armstrong.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more question.
Ms. Armstrong, I'll circle
Okay.
back. Ms. Garza.
Thank you, President Critchfield. Which department was requesting the speaker?
The superintendent's office, I'm requesting it.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit more about this? Why this speaker, not another one? What was the purpose? What was the end goal?
Sure. So the intent this year is to have an all-staff breakfast on the opening day when our entire staff comes back to work. And the hope is to have a guest speaker come in and start the year off with a particular message to inspire all of us to kind of move forward at the same pace with the same effort. So I reviewed speakers. This particular Premier Speakers Bureau has a list of approved speakers. I've also looked at what CSBA has had at a speaker conference before to review topics and individuals that speak to an educational facility to ensure that what we're talking about is really thoughtful for our students and thoughtful for our staff. And so that's the intent. George Quarles has written some books, and he speaks about having some issues of diversity and going beyond diversity and being able to address all students at all levels, which I think is very appropriate for our district.
Thank you. So how will we as a district continue with, I kind of saw a little bit of how we were going to maybe continue this message along, but how do you envision this message to carry on throughout the whole school year?
So one of our thoughts is to really center when we restart the year, center with a focus so that we're all very clear about what our areas are that we're addressing with our students in our instruction, the practices, our facilities, our goals, around a collaborative effort so that we're all moving forward again in that same direction. This speaker is to kind of highlight, kick that off, motivate all of us. And the intent is to follow through with what we're doing at sites continually when we're having those meetings to discuss, where are we with that long-term plan? How are we meeting some of those goals that we've set?
Do you envision them having this at their PLCs perhaps and having those goals in front of them as they move forward?
Absolutely, because your schools have all set action plans, and those action plans are addressed when they meet in their PLCs, which is, again, looking at data and developing next steps to address those things. All of this is all tied together, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garza. Dr. Al-Hassan.
Thank you. So is this going to be a one-time contract?
Right now is planned one-time, one-day event. It's for the all-district breakfast.
And then we won't be using them again?
We could, but this particular contract is just for one event.
Well, since this contract has some questionable areas from the legal standpoint, why would we want to use them more than once?
As our general counsel has shared with you, any speaker, I won't say all, but any speaker from this particular organization will have the same contract.
Right.
They all use the same template. So if it's questionable for him, it will be questionable for all from the same organization. So it's not specific to this particular speaker.
Right, but that's what I'm saying, the organization.
So if I might add, this particular agency has, this boilerplate contract, but any other agency that you go with, they're going to have the same kind of contract because it's more or less an industry standard. So basically, anywhere you look, other than maybe engaging a speaker individually, one-on-one, and creating a separate contract with them, that would be a lot more time-consuming in developing a contract and going through the terms and all that. So they act as kind of a middleman, and they allow you to have a more seamless process. But in order to do that, they apply their criteria or their conditions in order to be able to facilitate that.
But since the request and justification is really for a one-time use, for this particular speaker, the organization would need to be on contract continuously throughout the year, that we approve it for this one time, like we've done sometimes before.
It's going to come to you on the contract matrix as a ratification. So
For the-
yes, it will be listed for the school year, the 24-25 school year.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Do you want to use this organization throughout the year, or should we just use it for a one time? Regardless of the speaker, the organization.
So for clarification, right now I have plans to use this speaker one time.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Hassan. Ms. Armstrong, take your time.
Oh, my goodness.
You're good. I'll jump in. I'll give you a minute. I did look up George Couros, and I saw some of his YouTube videos, and some very happy with it. And thank you for looking around. I know you went through a lot of different options, so I understand the company and why they probably do things the way they do. But yeah, I'm good. Did I buy you enough time? You all right?
Okay, I'm gonna get through it. So it is within our budget, am I correct?
Yes, we do have funding to support it.
And then we're gonna follow up through our POCs, correct?
The thing that's going to be discussed and the focus is in alignment with what our district action is.
Okay, that's great. And one last question. Are we gonna get a book?
I will look into that for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Armstrong. Any other questions from the board before we move on? No? All right, moving on. Thank you for the work on that, council and superintendent. Next, we have a public hearing on the 24-25 Local Control and Accountability Plan, also known as the LCAP, and 24-25 Local Control Funding Formula, LCFF, Proposed Budget 24-25. We have two presentations. Ms. Azevedo.
Yes, so at this time, I'll turn the meeting over to Mrs. Carter, who is going to present the draft of the 24-25 LCAP.
Okay, tonight I'll be sharing some foundational information for people attending the public hearing that may not have had the opportunity to join us in May when we went through the LCAP and the annual update in detail. Although the board has had an opportunity at our last meeting to provide input, tonight we're required to provide an opportunity for the public to provide input at this hearing. This timeline shows the tail end of the LCAP development process, where we solicited input from a variety of educational partners. The LCAP, or District Plan for Student Achievement, is one accountability tool required by state law as a response to the state providing districts with less restrictive funding that allows for more local control as to how the funds are expended. Additional funding is provided based on the percentage of students that are unduplicated or are English learners, foster youth, or low income. The law requiring this plan also requires certain components to be part of the plan. Each plan must include goals and actions, related expenditures, services for identified student groups, and alignment to the 8 state priorities. The Bellflower LCAP includes these 4 goals, and they're aligned to the state priorities that you see on this table. The draft LCAP has been provided to the public for review, and the public had an opportunity to email input. We have received 1 email for suggestions for additional metrics and additional clarification to be added to some of the actions. This information will be reviewed and considered to be added to the final draft of the LCAP that will be approved at our next meeting. The LCAP has been provided to LACO as well for pre-review and feedback prior to final submittal. So based on the board's feedback in May and LACO's feedback, some revisions were made to both the annual update and the LCAP. In the annual update itself, the reclassification metric was added and clarification was provided to the goal analysis section regarding effectiveness of actions. In the LCAP, the annual performance section includes a reference to Somerset's performance of college career readiness and graduation rate. In the reflection section, reference was made to the support for differentiated assistance being provided by LACO. Pages 8 and 9 include reference to the equity multiplier funding and clarification for the purpose of the goal. All baseline metrics now include the year the data was collected. For Goal 1, there were clarifications that were made to some of the metrics, and additional metrics for measuring the reading domain for LPAC was added. And Action 10 also includes reference to a coordinator that would support English learner and dual immersion services. For Goal 2, additional metrics were included to measure the achievement of English learners and dual immersion students, and metrics for measuring achievement of Somerset students in the areas of college career readiness. Some clarifications and additions were made to the actions for this goal, such as the dual immersion expansion in the program. For Goal 3, there are changes at some of the metrics, and Action 4 was changed from contributing to non-contributing. And in Goal 4, the state priorities were referenced and student groups were added to the measurements for college career readiness. Some other revisions made to the remaining sections of the LCAP include explanations regarding how actions provided on a district-wide basis are targeted towards supporting unduplicated students and meeting their defined need. So those are additional things that were either changed or added to the LCAP and annual update based off the last time that we discussed. When you're reviewing this timeline, you're going to see that we're at the approval stage coming in June. So we'll be taking under consideration any feedback provided by the public during this public hearing. We'll be taking under consideration any further board information or feedback and LACO's revisions as well. After the board approval on June 20th, the LCAP will be submitted to the county for their final approval. They may ask for further clarifications and recommendations prior to approval. Ultimately, they'll have until October 8th to approve the LCAP.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. I think it's your line.
I'm sorry, are we ready to move on to our next presentation?
I think so. We'll open up the public hearing and discussion from the board after both presentations. Is that how we have it scheduled?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so then at this point, I'm going to have Mrs. Holguin now review the proposed 24-25 budget.
Thank you, Ms. Acevedo. Oops, excuse me. As shared this afternoon, I'll be presenting the board with the proposed budget for the 2024-2025 fiscal year. A few things to keep in mind as I share the numbers with you is that prior to the board taking action, we are required to have a public hearing following the LCAP, which is what Ms. Carter was also just sharing with you. The proposed budget is being presented alongside the 23-24 estimated actuals. Because of the statutory dates for the budget approval process, these numbers will most likely change as the books for the 23-24 year have not closed. And additionally, the governor's own budget, excuse me, which impacts school budgets, is not finalized. However, we did receive notification that the legislator approved his budget today, hot off the press. And I will explain more as we go through the presentation regarding anticipated changes. Additionally, I just want to note that we did make some few changes to the presentation you received as part of your board packet, just some grammatical corrections that we made. Okay, so first let's quickly review the budget cycle that we share with the board at every reporting period. You have in front of you a proposed budget with our recommendations based on known assumptions and developed expenditures that are in alignment with the LCAP. We are required to submit the budget using the standardized account code structure, which we call our SACS form. And while the LCAP shows the expenditures using a template that breaks down those expenditures under goals and actions, the proposed budget presents them under standardized object codes with specific categories as a whole expenditure for the districts. As you can see here, in the cycle, we have to have a public hearing, which is what we're having tonight, and then adopt a budget for the following year prior to July 1st, when the governor also may have not yet adopted his, which is again why the budget is fluid and the numbers will change. We wanted to provide the board with information regarding the development process to help understand how we come to the totals you will see tonight. And also how some of the totals may change, being that as you saw with the cycle, the budget cycle is a year-long process and involves the planning of both site and departments. As you saw in the previous slide, the development starts with the governor's release of his proposed budget. At that time, the district's fiscal department begins to develop the budget based on known assumptions that are released at that time. However, those may change at the May revise, which will be pointed out. The fiscal department then releases the budget allocations to the sites, which include standard budgeting staffing allocations for teachers, classified staff, and administration needed to operate a school. The district also provides allocations based on enrollment and unduplicated student percentage for the sites to budget on additional needs that they may determine are needed. Those budgeted items are connected to a goal and action that was presented on the LCAP. Departments are provided budget allocations similar to the sites for their staffing. However, our departments do use zero-based budgeting along with allocations to submit their needs. So for example, with our special ed department, they do not receive enough funding and therefore they will budget all their needs and unrestricted funds will need to support through a contribution. Meetings are held with stakeholders for input, and budgets are submitted to departments who oversee the funding, supplemental, concentration, title, for a preliminary review, and then moved forward to the fiscal department. The fiscal department compiles all of the budgets from each site and the department to develop what we have in front of you, what we will have in front of you tonight, which is the proposed budget, in order to present the fiscal condition of the district and whether or not we will be able to meet the proposed expenditures from the sites and departments. Upon adoption of the proposed budget, the budget is submitted to the county as part of the AB 1200 oversight requirements. And they will respond within 45 days as to whether they agree we will be able to meet our obligations and any recommendations they may have. A revision may be requested as well. So tonight, before we get into the numbers, we will provide you with assumptions used, the proposed budget totals for 2024-2025 for both revenues and expenditures, the general fund multi-year projections, the ending fund balance components, and additionally a fiscal stabilization plan that is being required from the Los Angeles County Office of Education for districts projecting significant deficit spending, and that was also requested of us as part of our second interim review action. So here you see information regarding the local control funding formula factors to help you understand what makes up that revenue. Each student who we collect ADA for generates funding, and depending on their grade span or need, will generate a certain amount. As you can see here, the base funding is increasing for each student based on the projected cost of living adjustment, also known as COLA. Those increases range from $106 there with our TK3 span to $129 with our 9 through 12th grade span. And TK also generates an additional $3,077. Additionally, you'll see in that chart there, if a student is identified as an unduplicated student, we receive supplemental and concentration funding. The breakdown of the LCFF funding will be provided on a future slide. I do want to note that, and it will be shown on the next slide, that these revised LCFF funding factors came during the May revision. Therefore, the COLA that you see here on this chart was released at the May revision, which is a 1.07% COLA. We were using a 0.76 COLA based on the governor's release in January, which is a difference of approximately $435,759 of an increase in revenue, which again will be updated in our first interim. Here you can see our assumptions, and as I noted from the previous slide, the assumptions used in the proposed budget are the COLA being used is 0.76, and again, that's because of when the development process began, which is a drop of from the original 8.22 for last year. Our ADA, which is based on a 3-year average, is dropping to 9,297, a change of 611 funded students. Please note that this is not enrollment, it is an average daily attendance. We do not generate funds off of our enrollment, we actually generate it based on our average daily attendance when students attend. Okay, first we look at the revenues. As stated, the proposed budget provides information alongside estimated actuals to show the difference from current year to proposed year. Our revenue comes from funding sources, with the biggest being our local control funding formula, known as LCFF, made of multiple sources, which you saw in the previous slide: base, supplemental, concentration, add-on, and equity multiplier. The second highest funding source is other, which includes special education master plan funding, lottery, career technical, to name a few. Based on the current assumptions and known budget information at this time, our revenue for the 24-25 year is decreasing by 14.2%, with the biggest decrease being in federal funding. That is due to the expiration and expended use of one-time funds. Additionally, our LCFF funding decrease is impacted by a drop in the funded ADA of 611 students, which you saw in the assumptions. This slide provides you with an additional visual representation of the revenue pie with the breakdown of specific sources to the overall funding source. As noted in the previous slide, you saw that the LCFF is the main funding source for our district. And here you see the breakdown of that LCFF funding with $78,752,456 is made up of our base funding. We get additional $34,478,031 is made up of our supplemental and concentration, which is in alignment with the information from the LCAP that Ms. Carter has presented to you. $27,414,970 is made up of LCFF property taxes with an additional $623,095 in a property tax transfer, which gives you that whole LCFF revenue of $141,268,952. Okay, so just another visual way of looking at our actual revenue intake. Now we look at we're presenting to you with the proposed expenditures that again are in alignment with the LCAP. However, the budget shows them not as goals that you saw in the LCAP presentation that Ms. Carter provided to you, but instead uses a standardized object source compiling all expenditures that are classified under these categories. The biggest expenditure you see here is for the source of salaries and benefits, which is expected. The increase proposed, which is the only one that has an increase, is due to step and column. The additional expenditures are aligned with our current LCAP, and it is also important to note that carryover expenditures are not part of the proposed budget. The proposed budget in the other sources does show a decrease for multiple reasons. Less revenue, as we saw in the previous slide, and also a decrease in one-time expenditures, both in the areas of services and other operating expenditures, as well as capital outlay, which would be any equipment over $5,000. Our total proposed expenditures for the year is slated to be $212,795,113, which is a decrease from the current year of $33,405,415. Again, here's a visual pie representation of our expenditures. The biggest slice of the pie is for salary and benefits, which currently, based on the budgeted expenditures, is 77%, followed by services and other operating expenditures, which is roughly 16%. Now looking at our revenue over expenditures with the side-by-side alignment of the current year estimated actuals and the proposed budget, we do see that, as shown in the previous slides, our expenditures are higher than our revenue. We are slated to intake for the 24-25 year by $27,229,792. We still end up with a positive ending fund balance for both our current fiscal year as well as our proposed. Please note that these numbers will change, as mentioned earlier, because our books for the 23-24 year are not closed. In a future slide, we do provide you with predictive budgeting numbers based on additional year-to-date actuals. Because our ending fund balance, as you saw on the previous page for 24-25, is slated to be higher than 10%, we are required to commit funds above the 10%. Here we are making a recommendation to the board based on previous directives as well as based on needs that we are saying may be needed due to economic uncertainties. Additionally, there are funds that must be committed due to restricted revenue. The two biggest components of the ending fund balance include restricted programs, where you see a total of $27,205,124, and included in that restricted is $14 million of Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funding, as well as $3 million in arts, music, and instructional materials. The deferred facilities, which is the second largest, is to cover projects the board has given direction to move forward with, which include the Mayfair Fields and Thomas Jefferson parking lot. In addition, it can be applied to other deferred facility needs included in the facilities master plan. These numbers will also change once you are presented with unaudited actuals. Before we go into our multi-year projections, we wanted to share a visual to show how fluid a budget is based on assumptions known at the time of reporting. School Services of California, which provides information regarding the governor's budget release as well as May revise, provided this visual to show how based on ADA decreases in the out years and COLA projections, your revenue can decrease with each reporting period. These changes impact the base funding revenue, which we have seen and will see with the multi-year projections. Here in front of you, you have Bellflower's multi-year projections based on assumptions used that have been presented to you. Because revenues are decreasing, which again is impacted by decreasing ADA in the out years, we are also proposing a decrease in expenditures. However, based on what we currently have previously presented in other reporting periods, which include unaudited actuals, we are making the board aware that we may need to deficit spend if revenues don't increase beyond what we currently know. Remember that for sure, we do know that the revenue will increase by a little over $400,000 due to the increase of COLA at the May revision. However, that increase would just reduce the currently known deficit spending by $400,000. We still meet our required 3% in 26-27, so that last column there, being that our ending fund balance, if everything worked exactly as being presented, now would be $35,306,654. The 3% required is $5,931,167. Multi-year projections are used to serve as proactive information to help with stabilizing and making short and long-term planning decisions. Based on the current multi-year projections we are sharing with the board, the district will be able to meet its current, proposed, and 2 future year obligations. I know the numbers are very small here, but as part of the state auditor's recommendation, we now present additional year-to-date information to the board based on year-to-date actuals. So this is not something you would see in your SACS report, but it's additional information that we now present. This information is as of April 30th, 2024. While our current estimated actuals do show that we are slated to deficit spend, our year-to-date recorded actual expenditures are not showing that. On April 30th, 2024, we are saying that if we were to close the books that day, we would have an excess of $22,957,549. Because the books are not yet closed and based on spending patterns, using monthly expenditure trends and known encumbrances, as well as current projects and invoices that have yet not been paid, we are predicting that we will end the year with $12 million in excess, and instead of spending the current budgeted amount of $249,614,482, we will spend approximately $203,789,205. Our estimated revenue for this year is $216,182,840. Again, this is all based on predictive forecasting which is used through monitoring, and therefore adjustments will be made after unaudited actuals reporting, which takes place in September. Because we are showing deficit spending, the county is asking us to submit a fiscal stabilization plan, even though our reporting shows we will meet our fiscal obligations for the proposed budget in 2 following years. Being that staffing is the largest cost and because we are experiencing declining enrollment, our fiscal stabilization plan includes reductions in staffing, both by eliminating our temporary teachers by 30 over the next 3 years, and also reducing extra duty both for certificated and classified staff. And here, as a recap, tonight is a required hearing of the proposed budget. As discussed, the budget was prepared based on the latest assumptions known at the time of development. The proposed budget does not include carryover funds for expenditures. We have accounted for some attrition based on declining enrollment, as well as the fiscal stabilization plan. All current known proposed revenue has been budgeted. All proposed expenditures are connected to the LCAP goals and actions. These projections, with the exception of the new COLA, are from the governor's May revise and are subject to change with the final state budget, which also impacts the ending fund balance. And as Ms. Carter also mentioned with the LCAP, the budget also will be up for adoption with our June 20th meeting, and also has to be submitted to the county prior to July 1st. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Holguin. At this time, I declare the public hearing open. Would anybody from the public like to speak on this item? Going once, going twice. All right. Come on up.
Not limited knowledge, but just looking at this right now, that number of 611 with ADA, I do know that Bellflower Unified has not done its due diligence with SARting and SARBing when our students are missing attendance. So we've had a big drop. I believe at my school, I don't even think they held a hearing, which they normally do, for all the parents to come for the initial SART. So that's one way that we could recoup that money. We also do not offer Saturday school or enrichment on Saturdays, which is another way that we could be enriching our students and recouping that money. And another thing about the budget, I believe the last time I talked to Sulema about our budget, it was either 2013 or 2018 that we actually did deficit spend, but year after year we predict deficit spending, which I understand that could be a common practice, but looking at that $100 and something million of our budget and the needs of our students, it seems a little concerning. So that was one thing that I wanted to mention with our budgeting, is that and another thing is we also have had a 25% reduction of students, but we have not reflected that in our reduction of staff. So we have some areas of improvement that we need to work on with our budget.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'd like to thank staff for all the work that they did with this. I know it's a lot of effort. Something I'd just like to remind everyone is at the end of this year, our predictive forecasting says we're going to spend just under $204 million, which would still put us under our proposed budget for next year. So hopefully we don't deficit spend, even if we meet, with the money that we will actually bring in, if we go along with similar to what we spent this year. And I'm always concerned that our proposed budget, when it comes to certificated salary, how we miss by millions of dollars. I'm not sure what we're doing with personnel or with that, but I think we should have that pretty tight with the budget. We shouldn't miss by millions. That's, looking at what we're doing with the fiscal stabilization plan, we have 30 teachers, and that's going to be a cost of $1.2 million. So we're missing by a lot of FTE there. And I think we can, if we tighten that up, that'll give us some more accurate numbers, give you a better idea of, the actual numbers that we're going to see going throughout the year. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing. Is there any discussion from the board? Vice President Stewart?
Where to start? I met with President Critchfield and our staff for 3 hours yesterday. Was it yesterday? I can't even think of my days right now. So we went over a lot of this, and I do understand a lot more. Again, it is concerning that we could be spending more money on our kids. So I guess my first ask is if we could, we know we have to be down to that 10%. If we could ask staff to come up with proposals on how to maybe spend some of this money on our students, what the restrictions are, what we can spend money on, if that's choir rooms, esports. We don't have middle school sports programs. There's so many things. I know, Clerk Garza talked about professional development, GLAD training, things like that. If we could maybe have staff just come up with some lists of ways that we're going to have to spend the money, that we can spend that, please. I'll come back around after you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart. Dr. O'Hesson.
Thank you. And one of my greatest concerns, and we talked about it, it's also in the LCAP, is chronic absenteeism, which affects our ADA. And I'd really like to see, when you look at expenditures and funding for our students, is what are we going to do in order to have students come to class and stay in class? And like I said, some of the teachers brought up some concerns to me in regards to they're on site, but they're not attending classes. So that's a big concern, especially when we have students who are falling behind academically, and a lot of these students are special ed students who aren't attending, that are contributing to our chronic absenteeism. So I'd really like to see a strategic plan of how we're going to be addressing that as we're moving forward. I know that it's a big issue across the state, but I haven't really seen anything put into action here in our district yet.
Thank you, Dr. O'Hesson. Vice President Stewart, would you like to go again? Oh, okay. No other questions from the board? No. I have a couple. First of all, let's see. I do find it very, again, I appreciate the time, like Vice President Stewart said, the time you spent to help us explain a little bit further and why we do things the way we do. But I honestly, I think the whole thing is silly. We were expected to plan ahead for an entire year, and the assumptions that we're given is we're going to be minus $33 million, but when really we're projecting that we're going to be ahead 12 million, which makes it very difficult to come up with a plan to spend the money that we need to year. And I could see how that would, I get the timeline. I know it's problematic, but I just think our guessing, I would just hope that we'd be a little bit closer to what the actual is going to be when it comes to the proposed budget. I don't know why the proposed and the proposed and the projected are so far off. Maybe can you help me explain that? Why is the proposed so far off from what we're actually projecting we're going to spend?
So the proposed in terms of like your estimated actuals that you see there in the numbers, and if we're talking more in the predictive of where we're going to end it this year.
Predictive.
Yes. So you have carryover expenditures that are included in that have been added in the year. And again, because the books are not closed yet, some of those things have not yet been fully expended and or may carry over to the next year. However, sites and departments have budgeted. So some projects that may be in the works are yet not fully, for example, with our one-time funding, because as you saw there with the revenue in terms of one-time funding, there's a huge decrease. We have the projects of our playgrounds going on right now, and that's a huge cost. However, we know for sure they won't all be finished by June 30th, and that would be a huge carryover in terms of expenditure cost.
Totally get it. It would be nice if those numbers were a little bit closer as far as us being able to plan. On page 14, we had discussed it, but we have two different areas of reserve for mitigation of economic uncertainties and then reserve for economic uncertainties. And I know the reserve for economic uncertainties is 3%, and then we have extra percent in the other category. Can you explain those two buckets of money and why we have two instead of one?
So yes, we like to delineate for you so that you're able to see what that 3% requirement is. And this is, again, a recommendation to the board. Should the board want to change that in terms of the ending fund balance and put it all under one, that can also be done. And or should the board want to decide that 4.5 million, decide to do it in a different committed category, that is also at the discretion of the board. In terms of the flexibility there for economic uncertainties, that allows, should there be a situation that that the board has to then dip into the ending fund balance because of a situation. That is why we've categorized it that way, but that is at the discretion of the board of making changes.
I understand the 3% in that specific bucket. But last year we had in that reserve for economic uncertainty, the 3%, it was double that. So is that going to be like the standard practice going forward, that's where the 3% goes?
Well, that changes based on your expenditures for that proposed budgeted year. So because the 3% is based off of the expenditures proposed for that year. So we do have a lower amount of expenditures for this budget for the 24-25 than we did for the 23-24.
Right. I think that's none of us up here are accountants, so I wouldn't want to say to change anything, but I think it's definitely a part where I haven't seen a lot of consistency, but it looks different than last year. And then just for clarification for the public, the deferred facilities, that is for those two projects, the Mayfair Fields and the Thomas Jefferson parking lot?
That is correct. That's set aside.
Great. I do have a couple more, but I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Madam Clerk Garza.
Thank you, President Critchfield. I'm sorry, Ms. Olguin. I'm still not understanding why we have those two categories. To me, you kind of just walked around in circles, and I still don't understand. Can you please just tell me, perhaps just me, in layman terms?
So remember, again, this is a proposed budget right now, so we make recommendations to the board. In terms of economic uncertainties, that would allow for if there was a need for additional funding for staffing or anything in the terms that we didn't get the revenue that were projected to receive for that year, and we needed to dip into our ending fund balance to meet any of our needs, then that amount there would be able to be used for that. However, the other bucket, the reserve for economic uncertainty, that's off of the 3% that we're required to have, that reserved. As a board, you can decide, do you want to put it all there, add the 4.5 million to the 6.3 and put it all under one, which would be more than the 3%. We like to show what it is that the 3% is required, or the board can decide to move that 4.5 into any of the other categories and add it to that ending fund balance component. So it just gives, our recommendation is to allow the board to have a little more flexibility based on the ending fund balance.
Okay, and so based upon your recommendations, I'm going to ask your recommendation right now. If we were to place it together, what would be the negative outcomes of doing that?
There would not be a negative outcome. We, again, just for visual and for understanding of what that percentage, that number is, that's the way we show it to the board so that you can see clearly what your 3% requirement is and then see what additionally you have. So there wouldn't be, because the number would still be the same as a total.
And so if we do place them under that one bucket, what would be the percentage then that we would be at? Because it wouldn't be 3% any longer, correct?
No, it wouldn't be 3%. So you're looking more closer to 8.59 in terms.
8.59, okay. And we are, by law, not supposed to go past 10%, is what I'm recalling?
No, anything that's more than 10% has to be committed, which is why you see these funds here, because overall, your overall ending fund balance is more than 10%. The 3% alone is just the 6.3 million that is there, but anything that is over 10%. So all of these components here are for the above the 10%.
Okay. I'm going to ask my colleagues, what do you guys think?
First off, I just wanted to chime in real quick. That's the reason why I asked if we could start a list of things, because obviously we're well over 10% and we're going to have to spend that money by law. So that was one of the reasons. I'm just looking at the expenditures. I guess it's nice that they look a little bit better, because you know how I am with books and supplies, and it's 18 million and we only are now 10 million. So we're saving 7.7, which in my mind was probably the closer to the actual number that we've always should have been spending. So,
you know,
I feel like it's better.
I agree with you. And I'm not sure if I can even make a very educated guess based on these numbers. It seems like I like that we are budgeting for maybe perhaps something that we always need to have extra money there to pay for that. But if these numbers would look closer to the real actuals that we would be budgeting for next school year, I think I would be more at ease making those decisions going forward. Like, for example, why is it that we don't have a clear number of how many teachers we will be employing next year? Is there a reason why? I mean, we have so much budgeted for that, but yet we're not using all of it?
In terms of like the way that the budget is presented with SACS reporting, it doesn't give you the FTE count regarding and the information there. However, for our FTE count, and let me just get that information for you for next year.
Because I mean, I'm assuming that we know how many teachers we're gonna probably need for the following school year, especially since you're telling us that we have a declining enrollment, but I'm assuming, again, that you've already kind of budgeted for that?
Correct. So when we send the budgets to the sites and the departments, we do provide them the budgets for their staff, their primary staff, as mentioned there in terms, and their classified staff. So currently the budget has 527 teachers slated in the budget. You just don't see that in terms of like an itemized here, because this is the SACS reporting information that you get.
Could we please have that provided to the board in our memo?
Sure.
Because I would love to see those, what that breakdown is and how much is each site really budgeting for those teachers. Because if we do have a need for a teacher, then perhaps that amount that we have here in those two buckets separately could perhaps maybe be used for that if there was a need for an extra teacher on that campus for maybe a couple years.
So let me clarify that, Ms. Garza, in terms of their prime assignments for the school. So let's say a school has 300 students enrolled and they need 11 FTEs to be able to service those 300 students. We do all of that budgeting for them in the sense, or we provide that budget a resource for them. However, if sites want additional teachers in terms of their intervention or anything like that, that is in alignment with the LCAP goals, then they submit that within their proposed budget. When we compile all of the budgets together from the sites, the departments, currently right now, based on that compiled information that has been provided to us, that is where we are looking at 527 currently within our budget in terms of everything together. But that includes your teachers that are needed based on classroom assignments, as well as some of the others that have been put in their proposed budgets.
So when we go through the reorganization of students and all that movement that we do at the beginning of the school year, you are telling me that we have already budgeted for that as well.
We have budgeted for that, but that may change depending on how many students show up. So if that happens, then that's where we present to you those revised budgets. So when you get that monthly in terms of the revised budget information, then you will see that. Additionally, you may have more attrition that will take place, and all of that is done within those revisions of the budgets.
Thank you. Ms. Garza, I'm going to make sure we get around, but I'll come back if there's more follow-up. Ms. Armstrong, Dr. Alhassan?
Yes, so in regards to moving funds around and the different allocations we have, if by chance there was some issues that came up with facilities that, God forbid, a fire or something to that nature, a flood, we would be able to use our reserve for economic uncertainty because of the fluid, because our budget is fluid, we can move things around for that particular area.
That is
for
correct.
Facilities. So even though we have these categories and the numbers are there, the flexibility and the movement for them is fluid, except for the local restricted grant funding. Is that correct?
Anything that is restricted,
Right.
you would not be able to use that funding. And the board, as part of their adoption process, adopts a resolution to be able to do that. At any time that the board feels that they want to make changes to that, that resolution can be brought back up to the board again to make those changes as needed. One of the because of how the cycle is, and to Mr. Critchfield's point in regards to books aren't closed and the information we're getting, once an audited actuals and first interim information comes, that's a good time to, again, look at everything and see where did we actually end the year and what are some changes that may need to be made.
So the governor's ending budget hasn't been allocated into what we're looking at right now. It would be at our next meeting.
Can you repeat that again?
The final budget approved by the governor has not been allocated into our budget that we're seeing now.
We have allocated, the only difference is the COLA that is being used, so that at the time of budget development, it was 0.76%. When we started the budget development, it's now increased to 1.07, but that's really roughly just a revenue of increase of over 400,000. However, there may be additional changes depending on new grants or different funding that comes about, and that's why those reporting cycles are very critical in knowing where you currently stand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alhassan. I have one question, and I'll kick it over to Vice President Stewart again. So on the classified salaries, I don't know how LACO put out a rankings, a bunch of data on schools, and that's something I want to talk to you about as far as like how they got some of the information, see how accurate it is. But as far as my first read, I noticed we're 46th out of 48 when it comes to classified salaries, and it looks like in our proposed budget there's another decrease from 27 million to 26.9. First, do you think that information is accurate? Does that sound right to you? Have we just historically been low on that? And I did notice we're also, I think, like 5th highest in contracted services. Does that play into it? Or I think, one thing I also thought of was like maybe it's because of the way we do transportation. Maybe that contracted services, makes us a little bit higher than other districts. What's your observation with that?
Well, we do, that is one example of a high contract in terms of not having that service within. So you're outsourcing that. So that would be a high cost in terms of a contract. That would be similar to the cost should you have it in here to some extent, right? In regards to the classified for this proposed budget, based on our analysis of what was submitted, is that there was a reduction in extra hours. And again, that's part of that is because the revenue has changed. So you do have less revenue. So you are budgeting less in certain areas. And that was one of the areas in terms of extra hours. However, depending on the change, once, budget revisions and carryover, you may see that increase because it does tend to be something that once the carryover is released, sites will budget more for extra hours.
Okay. That's definitely something I want to see get better. And again, I'd like to talk to you about the LACO report, the annual report. Have you seen that?
No, I know you mentioned it. I have not seen that one.
It's a thick book, but it has a lot of really good information. But I'm pretty competitive, and I like, when they start putting us in rankings, I'm like, all right, now we have some goals to hit. So something I want to talk about and do better there. One, I'll kick it over to Vice President Stewart.
Just really quickly, back to the two accounts, there are the two line items for the mitigation for economic uncertainty. If we're already above 10%, why would we be recommended to put that money into it?
Again, for flexibility in terms of different things, it's not for a specific, but the board can make whatever it is that they may feel. And it can be revised.
I guess I'm confused because if we're putting it in it, we're just adding to above the 10% that we're going to be forced to spend, right? So why would we put it there at all?
So remember, the 10%, it doesn't mean you're forced to spend it. What it means is it has to be committed for something that the board has identified as being something that they may need. And the recommendation is that it is for something that would be considered a one-time expenditure. So
right.
if
so
there
it has
was,
to be allocated, right?
Correct.
For a one-time expenditure. But we're going to allocate it because we have to, right? So wouldn't this just add more to allocate?
But this is not allocated in the proposed budget. This is part of your ending fund balance. So you wouldn't find it in your actual allocations that you see for the proposed expenditures. This is part of your ending fund balance.
Right, but isn't the ending fund balance, maybe I'm confused, isn't it going right back into there where they're telling us we're going to have to spend it because we're over 10% anyways?
Going right back into
The general fund, the reserve fund.
well, yes, it's part of the general fund, but it's part of your ending fund balance general fund, not part of your proposed expenditures.
I guess someone help me, but what I'm asking is if we're going to put it back in there and we have to allocate it, why would it be advantageous to put it for mitigation when we have to allocate it later or just allocate it right now?
You could make a change to it if the board wanted to make a change to a different category. It just has to, because you have more than 10%, you have to identify it as some kind of an allocation for some expenditure.
Please, someone, I still don't, I'm not still getting it.
Dr. Hassan.
Okay, so my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Salima, is that these aren't expenditures or fund balances. That's the difference. And by law, when she's saying that we have to spend anything that is within over 10%, the state wants to see that we're allocating funds that are used towards our district programs, facilities. So this is how the ending fund balance would look like, given our reserves.
Correct, but it's ending fund balance components, and we're putting more back into the reserve when they're telling us that we have too much in there to begin with. That's where I'm not understanding.
No. So first of all, I just want to clarify, you don't have to spend, you have to commit. So what the law says is that anything above 10% needs to be committed. However, if we were to combine it with the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, you are under the 10%, and it could go there. It could even go into your unassigned, unappropriated portion of it, because it's less than 10% when you look at that 4.5. We just made a recommendation to the board to give it a line item, but it could go under the unassigned. And basically, when it's unassigned, it means that at any time the board could use it for anything that is needed.
So my next question is, how often do we commit funds and allocate funds and don't spend them where we commit them?
So
Because isn't that kind of synonymous in the way, if we're allocating them, aren't we going to spend them there? Or do we just allocate things anywhere and not spend them there?
So the allocation of the funds is done at the adoption of the budget. That's when you're required to do it based on the ed code and what it says with the 10%. So at this time, that is a requirement because you are above that 10% threshold. In terms of when you actually have to expend them, that's up to the board in terms of when it officially comes through. So for example, with the deferred facilities, once those projects are fully completed, then that's when that funding would come out from there.
Okay, and my second question, just really quickly, I know before I came on the board, we allocated a lot of money and committed a lot of money for certain directors, for certain things that just were never filled ever. Is that still happening in our district? And can we possibly on our Friday memo get a list of if there were any major positions that we allocated budget-wise for that we did not place? Because again, we've allocated these because we feel like our students need them. So are there any of these types of positions that we did not fill and we just put the money back into our general fund? If we could get that information, please.
And those would be part of the proposed expenditures, but we can get you a list of vacancies.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Vice President Stewart. Ms. Garza.
Thank you, President Critchfield. I guess I actually want to know, what do you guys think, colleagues? Do we want to place those together? Because we can do it right now.
Like I said, I'm not an accountant. I understand there's reasons for things. I think it's a good conversation to have. But I'm guessing some things are just made visually so we can understand them here, but accounting-wise, there might be reasons for it otherwise. But I think it's a good conversation to have. Again, I think there needs to be more clarity on some of that.
And to your response, Ms. Garza, I would believe that the more we have things delineated in regards to how each component is going to be identified, then when we're moving things around, we're clear. Like if something's being moved from one area to another, we know why and what was being used for. If you're ending up lumping it all together and then we're not quite sure if another area might need the supplement or not need the supplement. That's just my understanding. So to me, I like seeing the breakdown. I like being able to know if we're going to be moving more money to deferred facilities, because costs were increased and we're going to need more than the 26 million identified. And then that would be coming from our economic uncertainty, or is that going to be coming from reserve mitigation economic uncertainties? So it's just good to understand for me when we're moving things around where it's coming from.
Thank you, Dr. Hesson. And one quick note before I kick it over to Mr. Armstrong is, and that is something we talked about the other day, is perhaps when we have committed funds and the board's already given direction, say on the Mayfair Fields, it's I think 18 plus, that's where that 26 million is coming from. It does give me anxiety knowing that that's already been committed, but it's sitting there, and when is that going to leave the account? Because it doesn't really show up in our multi-year. So I would recommend, to Ms. Garza's point, of perhaps like labeling that so we know that that's where that money is in that chart of accounts. Ms. Armstrong.
So as far as the reserve for economic uncertainty, I really do think that we should keep the 3% there so that we could know it's there. That's the bare minimum. That is our rainy day fund. So to keep it separated, again, I agree with Dr. Sue. It helps us see where the money is, because if we have it all in that reserve, and people see it, they're gonna misinterpret how much money we have, and it's like, why do we have so much in reserve when we need it now? So yeah, let's leave it there, or I'm telling you, we're gonna need more for the facilities, and then all those things will come out in the actual, the when they actually spend it. So that's what we really, really have to look for, is when we have the actual spending, that report that comes out. But yeah, just make it more clear for us, but the actual audits.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Armstrong. On that note, so just so I'm clear, because so say like that 3% for the rainy day fund, that's an allocation to be put in the reserve, right? But there's not a bucket that has all of the 3% that went into that bucket, so we know how much of the reserve came from that, right?
Well, the 3% is the minimum required reserve that a district must have in order to have a positive certification and say that they're going to be able to meet their fiscal obligations. Anything above that is, and even up to 10%, we wouldn't have to commit. In terms of, and I want to make sure I'm understanding your question and where the
me too.
pile.
I don't even know if I understand the question, so let me try to get there. So I think last year it was 7% or 6.8. Then say this year it's 3 and then plus 4, I think, right? And the other column is like 4, so it's like 7 total. So out of our reserve, is that also partitioned to say this is how much that we were putting aside year after year for the rainy day fund?
Well, your 3% required will change depending on your expenditures, your budgeted expenditures. So that's why that fluctuates.
Right. I understand like the allocation would fluctuate based on the percentage relative, but like say in our reserve right now, is that like where did that money all come from? Overages and like is there a way to trace back where that money wasn't spent years before in the reserve now? Or does it all just kind of get dumped in there?
It all gets rolled into goes into the general fund unless it's restricted. If it's restricted, then it has to stay as restricted funds, which you have those components there. And again, that was your arts and music grant as well as your ELOP. Those are your two major ones in terms of contributing to the restricted, but your other funding has rolls into that general fund.
So like it doesn't say where that money was saved from the previous year. So
so it could be interest, it could be supplemental, some concentration, it could be interest, it could be a variety of unrestricted funds that the district receives.
Sorry, and I'm going to kick it over to Ms. Armstrong in just a second. Okay, Vice President Stewart, but I will say, like in general, I think that there's just a spending problem. We have a lot of facilities that need a lot of work, and that's a separate problem. But for this, like our programs, a lot of the initiatives, all the great ideas that I've heard from staff, like this is when we get to do those things and actually spend the money on this year's kids. And I'm really hoping we do that. I'm not even hoping we do that. We have to do that. And I would encourage Superintendent Acevedo to develop a spending plan with staff that meets really where we know we're going to be, and not just what our budget tells us we're going to be at this very moment. That would be my strong recommendation at this point. And I do have one more question, and I'll just make it really quick before I kick it over to you, Amy. On the cafeteria, it shows, I know that's a separate account chart, but we're increasing that budget by $1 million, but their expenses are going down $1.2 million. Why do we need that much money in the cafeteria fund? Because they're not for profit. So why would they need $7 million?
So in terms, what Mr. Critchfield is discussing is those special funds that are part of your SACS reporting for your budget. And in the cafeteria fund, the estimated actuals for 23-24 were $5,136,283. And then in the proposed budget, there's $7,120,000. In the binder you have in front of you, just because I want to make sure everybody is able to know what Mr. Critchfield is sharing with you, that's Form 13. We did provide you a binder with tabs, and that's your cafeteria special revenue fund. And that is based on the proposed budget that our nutrition services has provided to us in terms of what they see that they need for spending. However, that fund is monitored very, very closely by the federal government in regards to their actual expenditures. And if they do hit a certain threshold in terms of ending fund balance, they are required to come up with a spending plan.
What is that threshold?
I don't have the exact number on that, but I know we're not there yet, or else they would be having to submit a spending plan. So with the reason for maybe them deciding to spend a little less is just they may be seeing that we may not get some funds in the future and they want to complete some programs, but we would have to get a little more information for you on that.
Yeah, I would encourage a spending plan. And also, I know a lot of the sites use our food services, which is amazing, and they do a great job. But I know a lot of our site funds go to catering, and it's going to them. And I would like to think if they're in a surplus and the rest of the districts is looking for cuts, I would expect like there to be some type of subsidizing of when sites are making an order, that we're not charging full price for our sites, because we'd like to keep that site money there so they could spend it on the students. I don't know who oversees that directly, but I would encourage a spending plan. I think that's totally necessary. And just really look at how we're conducting business with our other sites to make sure we're not just kind of like, because it all kind of goes back anyway. It's like we give money to sites, they're strongly encouraged to use the cafeteria, and then they're getting charged. I don't know. I'd like to see that happen.
And just a comment there in regards to these in special funds, because you have different funds that are part of your SACS reporting. Those, while the board doesn't monitor those in the sense of expenditure, they're there for us to ensure that they are where they need to be, because if they were to get in trouble, then the general fund would have to contribute into those special funds. So it's important to keep a close eye on them, so that if there was ever a situation, then the general fund would actually have to contribute to those funds.
Right. Understood. Vice President Stewart.
One of the things, going back to the topics that we were talking about earlier, when President Critchfield was talking about how he would like to know like when we can see what carries over, basically that's September 15 in the unaudited actuals, right? That's where we see exactly where we didn't budget correctly.
You'll see the actual unaudited actuals in terms of what actually came to once the books were closed.
And as far as being clear, like I hear my colleagues, I understand what you guys are saying about being clear, but every board meeting, we move mass amounts of money from category to category. So just because we put it in a certain place doesn't mean it stays there. I mean, we've already pointed out how many times we've moved books and supplies or capital outlay. So where it's allocated, I don't know. I just feel like if we're above our reserve numbers, why would we allocate it there when we are already above? Maybe I'm still not getting this. Someone again can help me, but it's not making sense to me.
And I just want to clarify, Ms. Stewart, that with those changes that you see monthly, which you're talking about with the budget transfers, those are all within the proposed budget, not within the ending fund balance. If you were to move any of this money, you would actually need a resolution to actually move it. But those expenditures that come to you as a board monthly, that sites are making budget expenditures, that's all within their proposed budgets that are part of the expenditures.
And at the end of the year, if they don't spend their proposed budgets, where does that money go?
Depending on what category it is, if it's, again, restricted, then it would go into the restricted. However, we do then release their carryover, and it may go back to the sites, and they would rebudget, and that's when we call the revisions of their budget with the carryover release.
The majority of our budget is unrestricted, correct?
Yes, a good portion, but you
So most of the money will go back into our general fund, correct? The majority of it. If it's not spent where it was allocated, it goes back into the general fund, and the majority of our general fund is unrestricted, correct?
Well, when you look at your page here in terms of your revenues, your LCFF, so looking at that page there.
Before you tell me that, can you just answer yes or no for me? Because then I can keep it easy. The majority of our money is unrestricted, and if the money allocated is not spent, it goes back into the general fund, correct?
The majority of your budget is unrestricted, and yes, it would go then into the general fund at that point when the books are closed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart. Dr. Alhassan.
I just want to comment, President Critchfield, when you asked where the money is spent on our programs on students, that's the LCAP. So if we want to make changes as a board, now's the time to make the change on any programs that you'd like to see. That's the purpose of the LCAP. So when I heard you speak about wanting to make sure money is spent on our students for the programs, here it is.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I appreciate that. That I agree. The LCAP is a great tool, and we're focusing on that to set direction and create our priorities. But in my opinion, respectfully, if it's not on your budget, if you don't have a dollar amount next to it, that's what will show our priorities. And historically, I think the plan to spend money and to invest in things and the actually doing it are two separate things. So that's my point of bringing that up. We can have an LCAP and say this is what we're going to do, but we got to put a dollar amount to it and make sure it's executed. I think that's the most important part.
And there was estimated dollar amounts to those programs.
Which program are you speaking of?
For the LCAP.
Which
there
program?
Was the entire LCAP had a projected budget of what we're going to be spending year 1, year 2, year 3.
Right, and I do understand what you're saying, but for example, the LCAP goal 1, I think, is to provide safe schools and learning experience. I think that's goal 1, right? But how we're doing that is where we're going to look in the budget and see, like, are we investing in more security? Are we looking at a proactive security hub for our campuses to be proactive with security? What are we doing? Are we doing new cameras? That's where I think the budget is the most important document that we oversee here as a board. Vice President Stewart.
If I'm correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the LCAP and the proposed budget, they tie together, correct? So we were over however many $1 million based on the LCAP. So to say that if we put it in the LCAP, that's where it's going to be spent, it doesn't seem to be proving true the last few years because we're way over or under budgeted. right? So we did the LCAP the last 3 years and we were under budgeted, right? So just because we put in the LCAP doesn't mean that's where the money is being spent. Am I correct about that?
Well, my understanding is when you're putting it into the LCAP and you want to allocate funds to a program, that's the time to do it.
And I think that's why we do these things together.
Right.
I'm going to further the conversation here. Vice President, okay. Any other questions from the board? No? Were you going for it? You were going for it.
gonna go for it.
Ms. Garza, go for it.
Interim superintendent, can you please send, and I don't know if any of the board is interested as well, but for the 4 years I've been here, I've been trying to figure out this budget. And to me, it's very embarrassing for me to not understand it quite fully. Could you just please send me maybe perhaps some CSBA, like Budget 101 again, because we do get it when we become board members. But I think that this is what I want for myself at least, and maybe if any of my other colleagues are interested, is like a deep dive into budget, the budget process, the terms, the terminology. Because I think it's sometimes a little difficult to follow you and staff, well, mostly staff, without the deep knowledge that our staff has. And I think it's I don't want to get this wrong. This is for our kids, and I agree with my board members. We're not a piggy bank. We need to spend these funds as much as we can for our kids for today. So if I myself can educate myself and be better in that, I think I would be making a lot better decisions, because it's obvious that having these conversations right now, we didn't get anywhere. And I don't want to waste anybody's time.
Okay, Ms. Garza, so what I can provide you, if you'll allow me some time, a few days to do this, why don't we pull together a summary document that helps you walk through the budget and the LCAP, and then maybe some additional resources from CSBA or other sources talking about back to basics kind of budgeting procedures that'll help you walk through, and maybe, again, some of the documents that we've already shared about our timeline and what we've done here, but we can do a deeper dive walk through the budget if that would help.
Yes, that would be so helpful for me, myself. I don't know if any of my other colleagues would like to join me, because then I would understand what you're saying, what you're talking, the reasons why you're doing these things, because to me, it's not very clear yet. And I do understand some of it. I don't want to say that I'm naive to all of it, but there are certain holes I have, and I almost feel like I need a remedial class on budget. So if I want to be the best board member for my students and for our kids and our community, I need to fill those holes now.
Understood. We want that clear for you.
Thank you, Ms. Garza. And I appreciate the amount of humility that you have, but I think you understand it well enough. And I think that that's kind of where we're at right now, is we're understanding it more and more. And I think that there's things that could be better. I think that there's definitely things that could be better. And I think it's almost like the more you understand, the more you feel like, oh, what am I missing? But honestly, I think we understand it pretty well. So I think you're being very humble with that. But I appreciate that. And thank you, staff, for doing it. Sulema, thank you for answering all the questions. I know we have a lot of them, but this is, one of the main functions of this board is budget oversight. And I know me and all board members take this very seriously. And I honestly believe that we're going to have a great year and we're going to do great things in this district, but it starts with the budget and having it reflect our priorities as a district. So I appreciate all of the work. And thank you, colleagues, for all the questions. All right. Did I close the public hearing? I did. All right. Moving on to major action. We have one major action this evening. Item 6.1, resolution to order biennial governing board election. Do we have any questions or comments from the board? Ms. Garza.
Thank you, President Critchfield. I just want to say, just a very brief comment. Thank you to our communities. Thank you to our staff. That was a very tight schedule that we had to run. So I appreciate all the hard work and effort that went into doing that. I know that it wasn't easy. And my colleagues, I just want to thank you as well for, having that foresight to continue that work, and to also, especially I want to give props to our board member, Stewart, because if it wasn't for her bringing it up at the beginning, and I know I was like, what are you talking about? We don't need to do this, but yes, we did. So thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm really happy that we arrived at a map that was approved by 5-0 vote, and I'm looking forward to continuing on. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Vice President Stewart.
I appreciate it 100%, but I do want to say that the reason I brought it up was because a community member brought it up to me. So again, that's where it takes us working as a team. It takes you guys coming to us and telling us things to ask. We're learning too. We don't know all the questions. Like I said, we're all getting better. We haven't been here, but it was a community member that brought that forward to me, and I brought that to our superintendent at the time. So thank you. It was all him. And I just want to continue to ask the community to keep reaching out to us when there's things like that you guys see. So thank you for you guys.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart. Since we're throwing out thanks, I'm going to throw out a thank to Sariga. Thank you. I know there was a lot of work, again, tight turnaround, and I think the county said it best when they recognized the thoroughness of our process, and it's a reflection of your excellence. So thank you very much.
And if I could add to that, just had a conversation with the executive for the county committee, and she asked if she can use our presentation and the work that we provided as an example for the 25 other school districts left in the county that it makes. But they were very complimentary of the district and everything that was put forth. So that comes down to the board and your leadership. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the board? No? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve item 6.1, resolution to order biennial governing board election?
You have that motion.
Thank you, Ms. Armstrong.
Second.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart. Roll call, please.
Ms. Armstrong?
Aye.
Dr. Alhesson?
Aye.
Mrs. Garza?
Aye.
Ms. Stewart?
Aye.
Mr. Critchfield?
Aye. Motion passes. If there's no objection, this meeting is adjourned at 6:30 p.m. until the regularly scheduled board meeting to be held Thursday, June 20th, 2024. Thank you and have a great night.